Everyone in the valley feared the wolves that ruled Blackpine Forest. Parents pulled their children indoors before sunset. Hunters whispered prayers before stepping beneath the ancient pines. Travelers hurried past the tree line without daring to look into the shadows where countless golden eyes were said to watch in silence. Yet on the coldest night anyone could remember, one lonely woman broke the oldest law of the valley. She offered her final piece of bread to a wounded wolf pup trembling beneath a frozen bridge. By sunrise, the little creature had vanished without leaving so much as a paw print behind. Then, when darkness returned, the earth itself began to tremble. Hundreds of wolves emerged from the forest without a single growl, and leading them was a giant silver wolf whose presence made even the winter wind seem to fall silent. The villagers expected death. Instead, every wolf lowered its head before the woman who had saved a single forgotten pup. None of them knew that one simple act of kindness was about to awaken a promise buried for centuries, and change the fate of an entire kingdom forever. Winter arrived early that year. Snow covered the hills long before the final harvest had been gathered, swallowing narrow roads, frozen streams, and forgotten footpaths beneath endless blankets of white. Smoke drifted lazily from crooked chimneys as families huddled close to their fireplaces, hoping the wood stacked outside would last until spring. Far beyond the prosperous towns of the kingdom stood Briar Hollow, a village so small that few maps even bothered to mark its name. It rested between towering mountains and the endless edge of Blackpine Forest, where ancient pines stretched toward the grey sky like silent guardians of forgotten secrets. Life there had never been easy. The land gave only enough to survive, never enough to prosper. Each winter claimed something from the villagers. Sometimes it was their livestock. Sometimes their homes. Sometimes those they loved most. Among the weathered cottages stood one little stone house with ivy climbing its walls despite the cold. Its roof leaned slightly beneath the weight of fresh snow, and tiny bundles of dried herbs hung beneath the wooden porch, filling the air with the faint scent of rosemary, pine needles, and lavender whenever the wind passed through. This was Eliana's home. She had lived alone ever since sickness had stolen both her mother and father during the same cruel winter many years before. People often wondered how someone so young could carry such loneliness without becoming bitter. The answer could be found every morning before sunrise. While most villagers hurried past the freezing streets with their heads lowered against the wind, Eliana could usually be seen kneeling beside an injured bird, repairing a broken basket for an elderly neighbor, or leaving fresh water outside for wandering animals. Kindness had become as natural to her as breathing. Not because life had been kind in return, but because she knew exactly how painful loneliness could feel. That morning, she wrapped a faded wool cloak tightly around herself before stepping outside with a woven basket hanging from one arm. Snow crunched softly beneath her worn boots. The sky remained hidden behind thick clouds, promising another storm before sunset. She walked toward the forest's edge where stubborn winter herbs still grew beneath sheltered rocks. Though the kingdom's healers ignored such simple plants, the villagers often relied upon Eliana's remedies more than expensive medicines from distant cities. She carefully brushed away snow from a patch of silver leaf. Tiny green leaves peeked through the frost. A gentle smile warmed her face. "Still fighting," she whispered quietly. The wind answered by stirring the pine branches overhead. Far away, a lone wolf howled. The sound floated across the valley before disappearing into the mountains. Eliana paused. Unlike most people, she did not hear hatred inside that lonely cry. She heard distance. She heard survival. She gathered the herbs until her basket was nearly full before beginning the long walk home. Along the way she stopped at old Mrs. Harlow's cottage. The elderly woman struggled to chop firewood after her husband passed away 2 winters earlier. Without saying a word, Eliana picked up the heavy axe resting against the stump. Each swing echoed through the cold morning. Wood split cleanly beneath her steady hands. By the time Mrs. Harlow opened the door carrying a steaming cup of broth, an entire stack of firewood stood neatly arranged beside the porch. "You'll freeze before you help everyone else," the old woman scolded gently. Eliana accepted the warm cup with grateful hands. "I'll be fine." "You always say that." Mrs. Harlow studied the young woman carefully. "And yet you always come home with less than you leave carrying." Eliana laughed softly. "There are worse things than sharing." The older woman's smile faded. There are, when winter grows hungry. Neither spoke again. They both understood what those words meant. Food had become scarce. The village mill had little flour left. Hunters returned with empty carts more often than full ones. Even the rabbits seemed to have disappeared beneath the endless snow. When Eliana reached home that afternoon, she emptied her basket onto the wooden table. Fresh herbs. A handful of mushrooms. 2 small onions. 1 loaf of coarse bread. It would need to last nearly a week. She quietly divided the loaf into careful portions before placing them inside a small cloth bag. Outside, the sky darkened. The first heavy snowflakes began falling. By sunset, the gentle snowfall had become a raging storm. Wind slammed against the cottage walls with enough force to rattle the windows. Snow swirled through the darkness like ghosts dancing beneath the moonless sky. Most people locked their doors. No one ventured outside once a Blackpine storm truly began. Eliana had just finished placing another log upon the fire when something unusual reached her ears. It wasn't the wind, nor the groaning trees. It sounded almost like crying. She held her breath. The faint whimper came again. Barely audible. Weak. Frightened. She lifted the lantern from its hook. No. She whispered to herself. It couldn't be. Another cry drifted through the storm. This time it was unmistakable. Something alive was suffering outside. Every sensible thought urged her to remain indoors. The roads were buried beneath snow. The river crossing had frozen days earlier. People vanished during storms like this. Some were never found again. Still, she reached for her cloak. Moments later the wooden door opened against the screaming wind. Snow immediately rushed inside. The cold bit through her clothes so sharply it stole her breath. Lantern held high, Eliana stepped into the blizzard. The storm swallowed her footprints almost instantly. She followed the tiny cries through twisting paths that were becoming harder to recognize beneath the growing drifts. The bridge crossing Frost Creek finally appeared through the swirling white. Its ancient wooden beams creaked beneath sheets of ice. The river below had nearly frozen solid except for a narrow ribbon of dark water fighting stubbornly against winter. Then she saw it. Beneath the bridge. Half buried in snow. A tiny grey wolf pup. One hind leg remained trapped between broken branches locked inside the ice. Its thick fur had frozen into stiff spikes. Each trembling breath escaped as tiny clouds that vanished into the storm. One frightened blue-grey eye slowly opened. The little animal tried to growl. Only a weak whimper escaped. Eliana slowly knelt several feet away. "I won't hurt you," she whispered, though she knew the frightened creature could never understand her words. Its tiny body trembled harder. Blood stained the snow around its injured leg. Fresh tracks surrounded the bridge. But they ended abruptly. No mother. No pack. Nothing. The storm had erased every answer. Carefully placing the lantern beside her, Eliana removed her gloves. The icy wind instantly burned her fingers. She pushed aside frozen branches one by one until she reached the trapped leg. The pup cried out. Its small teeth snapped weakly toward her hand before exhaustion stole even that last bit of strength. "I'm sorry." Her voice trembled. "This will hurt." With all the strength she could gather, she pulled apart the ice-covered branches. A loud crack echoed beneath the bridge. The pup slipped free. For one heartbeat it simply lay there, too weak to move. Then it collapsed completely into the snow. Eliana gently wrapped it inside her wool cloak. Its body weighed almost nothing. Too light. Far too light. As she lifted the tiny creature against her chest, she felt its racing heartbeat. Fast. Fragile. Fading. The storm roared louder around them. Somewhere deep inside Blackpine Forest. A long, powerful howl shattered the night. Then another answered. And another. Until the mountains themselves seemed to awaken. Eliana looked toward the endless wall of dark trees. Dozens of distant golden lights flickered between the trunks. Watching. Waiting. Her heartbeat quickened. She pulled the trembling pup closer and hurried back toward the village, never realizing that unseen eyes followed every step she took through the snow. The storm did not loosen its grip on the valley. Snow swept across the empty fields in restless waves, erasing fences, pathways, and footprints as though the world wished to hide every secret before morning arrived. Above the rooftops of Briar Hollow, smoke struggled to rise against the fierce wind, only to be torn apart and carried into the darkness. Eliana pushed open the cottage door with her shoulder. The frightened wolf pup remained wrapped tightly inside her cloak, its tiny body barely moving. The moment she stepped inside, warmth from the fire met the freezing air, filling the room with the comforting scent of burning oak and dried herbs hanging from the ceiling. She quickly shut the door. For several moments she simply stood there, breathing heavily. Snow melted from her cloak and dripped onto the worn wooden floor. Her fingers had grown so numb that they barely obeyed when she untied the cloak and gently laid the little wolf beside the fireplace. The pup did not move. Its breathing came in shallow, uneven breaths. Its silver-grey fur, beautiful beneath the ice, was stained with mud and frozen blood. Eliana knelt beside it. "Oh, little one." She reached for a clean linen cloth and dipped it into a bowl of warm water. Steam curled into the air. Carefully, she began washing away the blood. The pup flinched. A quiet whimper escaped its throat. "I know," she whispered softly. "I know it hurts." She worked slowly, speaking in the same gentle voice she used when calming frightened birds or abandoned lambs. The wound around the hind leg was deep. Sharp ice had torn through the flesh. Fortunately, the bone had not broken. That alone felt like a miracle. She crushed silver leaf with lavender petals and pine resin inside a small stone bowl until they formed a fragrant green paste. The familiar smell filled the cottage. It reminded her of childhood afternoons spent beside her mother, who had patiently taught her which plants healed and which only looked beautiful. Her mother had always said the forest gave medicine to those willing to notice. Eliana smiled sadly at the memory. She carefully spread the herbal mixture across the wound. The little wolf squeezed its eyes shut but no longer struggled. Perhaps exhaustion had become stronger than fear. Or perhaps some small part of it had begun to understand that these hands brought comfort instead of pain. She wrapped the injured leg with fresh linen before placing an old wool blanket near the fire. Only then did she realize the pup was staring at her. Its pale blue-gray eyes never blinked. There was no anger inside them, only confusion. As though it had never imagined a human would choose kindness over fear. Eliana gave a tired smile. "There. You'll heal." The wolf pup lowered its head onto the blanket. Within moments, sleep claimed it. Outside, the wind screamed against the windows. Inside, only the crackling fire disturbed the silence. Eliana looked toward the small cloth bag resting upon the table. Inside remained the bread she had carefully divided for the coming week. She opened the bag. 6 small pieces. No more. She stood motionless. The winter had only begun. No one knew when fresh supplies would reach Briar Hollow again. Every bite mattered. She looked back toward the sleeping pup. Its ribs showed clearly beneath its damp fur. It had not eaten properly for days. Perhaps longer. She closed her eyes. Her father's voice seemed to return from somewhere deep inside her memories. When kindness costs nothing, almost anyone can offer it. The true measure of the heart is what it gives when giving becomes painful. A quiet breath escaped her lips. She reached into the bag. Without hesitation, she picked up the largest piece. Then another. She broke the bread into tiny pieces and soaked them in warm broth until they softened. The smell drifted gently through the room. The little wolf's ears twitched. Slowly, it lifted its head. Its nose moved cautiously through the air. Eliana placed the bowl on the floor before stepping back. For a long moment, the pup simply watched her. Then hunger finally defeated fear. It limped forward. Each step looked painful. Its injured leg barely touched the floor. The tiny creature lowered its nose to the bowl. At first it sniffed uncertainly. Then it began eating. Not greedily. Not wildly. But with the desperate care of something that had learned food could disappear at any moment. Eliana watched quietly. She did not realize she was smiling until tears suddenly blurred her vision. The little wolf was alive. That was enough. When the bowl was empty, it looked up at her once again. Tiny crumbs clung to its whiskers. For the first time, its tail gave the smallest movement. barely noticeable. One gentle sweep against the floor. Eliana laughed softly. "I'll take that as a thank you." The pup blinked once, then curled itself into a small grey circle beside the fire. Sleep came quickly. This time, it slept without trembling. Morning arrived hidden behind thick clouds. The storm had finally passed. Fresh snow glittered beneath pale sunlight. Eliana awoke to silence. The fire had burned low. She stretched carefully before looking toward the blanket. Empty. She frowned. The front door stood slightly open. Cold air drifted quietly into the cottage. Fresh paw prints crossed the floor before disappearing outside. The little fool. She hurried to the doorway. Snow sparkled across the valley like scattered diamonds. The tiny tracks led toward the forest. Only halfway across the clearing, the pup stopped. It turned. For several long seconds, it simply looked back. The morning breeze stirred its silver fur. Sunlight touched its face. It seemed healthier already. Stronger. The little wolf held her gaze. Then it lowered its head. Not out of fear. Almost. As though offering respect. A heartbeat later, it vanished between the ancient pines. The forest swallowed it completely. Eliana remained standing in the doorway long after it had disappeared. "I hope you find your family," she whispered into the cold morning air. She closed the door. Life returned to its ordinary rhythm. Or so she believed. By afternoon, strange stories began spreading through Briar Hollow. A hunter claimed he had seen dozens of enormous wolf tracks crossing the northern ridge. Another swore he had heard howls echoing in broad daylight. Children whispered that golden eyes watched from the forest every evening before sunset. Old Mrs. Harlow shook her head. "They're gathering." Someone nearby crossed himself. "They haven't gathered like that in generations." Fear settled over the village like another snowfall. Doors were locked earlier than usual. Animals were brought indoors before dusk. No one dared travel near Blackpine Forest. Even the birds had disappeared. An uneasy silence spread across the valley. Eliana tried to ignore the growing anxiety. She spent the afternoon delivering herbal medicine to a sick child. She repaired a widow's broken fence. She carried water for an elderly couple whose well had frozen. Yet everywhere she went, people whispered, "Wolves. So many. They're coming closer." As evening approached, the air became strangely still. Not even the wind moved. The silence felt unnatural. Heavy. Waiting. Eliana stepped outside with a bucket to gather fresh snow for drinking water. Halfway across her yard, she stopped. Something had changed. Every horse in the village had gone silent. No dogs barked. No birds sang. The entire valley held its breath. Then, a single deep howl rolled across the mountains. Not wild. Not angry. Powerful. Ancient. Before its echo faded, another answered. Then another. And another. Until the sound surrounded Briar Hollow from every direction. Lanterns lit one by one across the village. Doors opened. Faces appeared. No one spoke. Far beyond the first line of pine trees, golden eyes began appearing in the darkness. 1 pair. Then 5. Then 20. Then hundreds. They stood perfectly still. Watching. Waiting. The snow beneath the moon reflected against their silent figures until the edge of Blackpine Forest seemed alive. Yet not one wolf crossed into the village. Not one growled. Not one bared its teeth. It was as though they had gathered for a purpose known only to themselves. A path slowly opened through the center of the great pack. Every wolf stepped aside. The earth seemed to tremble beneath slow, measured footsteps. From the darkness emerged a wolf unlike any creature the villagers had ever imagined. His coat shimmered like silver beneath the moonlight. Old scars crossed his broad shoulders, each one telling the story of battles survived. His amber eyes held neither hatred nor mercy, only quiet authority. He walked with the calm confidence of a king who had never needed to prove his strength. Every wolf lowered its head as he passed. Even the wind seemed to fall silent. The Alpha King had come, and his unwavering gaze rested on only one person. Ileana. No one moved. The entire village stood frozen beneath the pale winter moon, as though even breathing too loudly might awaken something terrible. The silver wolf stopped at the edge of Briar Hollow. He did not snarl. He did not bare his fangs. His massive paws rested quietly upon the untouched snow while hundreds of wolves remained perfectly still behind him. It was not the silence of hunters preparing to strike. It was the silence of a royal court awaiting its king's command. The villagers slowly backed away. Several fathers stepped in front of their children. Mothers pulled frightened little ones into their arms. A few hunters gripped their bows so tightly that their knuckles turned white. Old Gerrick, the village blacksmith, raised a heavy spear with trembling hands. "If they move," he whispered, "we fight." No one answered him. Everyone knew the truth. Against so many wolves, there would be no fight. Only a slaughter. Eliana stood in the center of the square, her lantern swaying gently in her hand. The warm light danced across the snow, reaching only a few feet before disappearing into the endless darkness. Her heart beat so loudly she could hear it inside her ears. Every instinct told her to run. Instead, she remembered the tiny wolf curled beside her fireplace. The frightened eyes. The shaking body. The quiet movement of its tail after it had eaten. Her breathing slowly steadied. The great silver wolf never looked away from her. His golden eyes held an ancient calm. They were unlike any animal she had ever seen. There was intelligence there. Wisdom. A sadness that seemed older than the mountains themselves. Then something stirred among the wolves. A smaller figure limped through the great pack. Gasps spread across the villagers. It can't be." The little grey pup emerged into the moonlight. Its injured leg was still wrapped in the clean white bandage Eliana had tied the night before. Although it walked carefully, there was strength in its steps now. Its blue-grey eyes brightened the instant they found her. Without hesitation, the pup trotted across the open snow. Hundreds of wolves watched. Not one followed. The little wolf stopped before Eliana. For a brief moment it simply looked up at her. Then it gently pressed its nose against the back of her hand. The village square fell completely silent. Eliana smiled despite the fear surrounding her. "You found your family." The pup gave a soft whine. Its tail wagged once, then twice. The enormous Alpha King watched every movement without interruption. Slowly, the young wolf turned toward him. Something glimmered beneath the moonlight. The pup carried a small object carefully between its teeth. It stepped forward once more before laying the object gently upon the snow at Eliana's feet. A pendant. Its chain appeared to be woven from dull silver, unlike any metal forged by village smiths. At its center rested a smooth stone the color of deep emerald. Strange symbols circled its surface. The carvings shimmered faintly beneath the moon as though tiny stars had been trapped inside the ancient markings. Eliana slowly knelt. The pendant felt strangely warm despite the freezing night. The moment her fingers touched it, a faint pulse traveled through the stone. Not painful. Almost like a heartbeat. She frowned. "What is this?" The Alpha King lowered his massive head. It was only a slight movement. Yet every wolf behind him copied the gesture. Hundreds of proud creatures bowed together. A wave of astonished whispers spread across the villagers. They're bowing to her. No. They're honoring her. Even old Gerrick slowly lowered his spear. No one had ever seen wolves behave this way. The Alpha King lifted his head again. For one long moment, his gaze remained locked with Eliana's. There was gratitude there. No words. None were needed. The little pup had been returned safely. A debt had been acknowledged. The ancient king slowly turned away. The great pack began moving with him. Silent. Graceful. Within moments they would disappear into Blackpine Forest once again. Then, the peaceful night shattered. "Seize the witch." The roar echoed across the valley. Every head turned. Torches blazed along the northern road. The pounding of horses thundered through the frozen ground. Steel flashed beneath the moonlight. Dozens of royal soldiers stormed into Briar Hollow wearing heavy blue cloaks embroidered with the golden crest of King Aldrich. Their horses sprayed snow in every direction as they surrounded the village square. Leading them rode a broad-shouldered man with cold grey eyes and a trimmed black beard. His polished armor reflected the firelight. A crimson cape flowed behind him. Commander Roderick dismounted with swift confidence. His expression hardened the instant he saw Eliana holding the strange pendant. "So," he said quietly, "the reports were true." He looked toward the forest. The wolves had not attacked. They simply watched from beyond the trees. The Alpha King remained standing beneath the shadows of the towering pines. Perfectly still. Commander Roderick narrowed his eyes. "A woman speaks with wolves." His voice grew louder. "The kingdom has searched years for proof of forbidden forest magic." Several frightened villagers stepped forward. "She hasn't done anything wrong," Mrs. Harlow pleaded. "She only helped." Silence. The command struck harder than a slap. 2 soldiers pushed the elderly woman backward. She nearly fell into the snow. Eliana instinctively moved toward her. "I helped an injured animal." Commander Roderick laughed without warmth. "You expect me to believe that?" His gaze dropped to the bandaged leg of the young wolf. Then toward the Alpha King. Then back to the pendant. "The legendary ruler of Blackpine personally visits a forgotten village." He stepped closer. "And leaves an ancient relic at your feet." His eyes became colder. "No peasant receives such gifts." Eliana tightened her grip around the pendant. "I don't know what it means. But I know this." She looked toward the little pup. It was hurt. It was alone. "So I helped." The commander stared at her for several silent moments. Then he smiled. It was the kind of smile that never reached the eyes. "You'll explain everything to His Majesty." He nodded once. The soldiers moved immediately. Steel chains rattled. 2 men seized Eliana's wrists. The lantern slipped from her fingers. It struck the snow. The flame hissed out. Darkness rushed across the square. "No!" Mrs. Harlow cried. "You can't take her." Several villagers stepped forward. More soldiers lowered their spears. The confrontation froze. Then, a low growl rolled from the forest. Not loud. Yet every horse immediately panicked. Several reared onto their hind legs. Others refused to move forward. The soldiers struggled to calm them. Commander Roderick slowly turned. The Alpha King had not moved. Yet his eyes burned like molten gold beneath the moonlight. Behind him, hundreds of wolves stood shoulder to shoulder. Perfectly silent. Perfectly ready. No attack came. No charge. Only a warning. An unmistakable one. The commander understood. He clenched his jaw. "We leave." The soldiers dragged Eliana toward the waiting horses. She looked back only once. The little wolf heir stood beside the Alpha King. Its ears flattened. A quiet whine escaped its throat. The Alpha King gently lowered his head toward the young wolf. As though reminding it. Not yet. The time for action had not come. Eliana's eyes filled with tears. Not because she feared where she was being taken, but because she saw something unexpected in the great king's face. Helplessness. He could defeat armies. He could command every wolf in Blackpine. Yet if he attacked now, war between wolves and mankind would begin before sunrise. So he remained still, carrying the burden that only true rulers understood. Sometimes the greatest strength was choosing not to fight. The horses disappeared into the snowy night. The village lights grew smaller behind them. High upon the ridge overlooking Briar Hollow, hundreds of wolves watched in complete silence. None followed. None turned away. They simply watched until the last torch vanished into the darkness. Far ahead, beyond frozen rivers and towering mountains, the royal capital waited. And hidden behind its towering stone walls lay truths that had slept for centuries. Eliana had no idea that the small pendant resting against her heart was no ordinary gift. It was a key. And before the next full moon rose above Blackpine Forest, kings would kneel, ancient promises would awaken, and the fate of an entire kingdom would rest in the hands of the woman who had once shared her last piece of bread with a wounded wolf pup. The journey to the capital lasted 4 long days. Snow covered the road so deeply that the horses often struggled to pull the heavy wagons through the mountain passes. The wind never seemed to tire. It swept down from the white peaks with a sharp, icy edge that slipped beneath cloaks and armor until every traveler welcomed even the briefest glimpse of sunlight. Eliona rode in the last wagon. Her wrists were no longer chained, but 2 guards remained beside her every hour of the journey. They spoke little. Whenever she looked toward the forests rolling past beyond the frozen fields, they watched her as though expecting wolves to burst from the trees at any moment. She said nothing. Instead, her fingers rested around the pendant hidden beneath her cloak. The stone remained strangely warm. Even during the coldest nights, it never lost its gentle heat. Sometimes she could almost feel it pulsing against her palm. Not quickly. Not slowly. Steady. Like the quiet heartbeat of something still alive. Each evening, when the caravan stopped beside roadside inns or abandoned watchtowers, Eliona searched the distant tree line. She never saw the wolves. Yet more than once she caught the faintest glimpse of silver disappearing between snow-covered pines. Watching. Always watching. On the morning of the 5th day, the mountains opened into a wide valley. Beyond it stood the royal capital of Erindor. Its enormous stone walls rose above the surrounding countryside like the cliffs of a forgotten age. Tall towers pierced the grey sky, each crowned with fluttering blue banners bearing the golden stag of King Aldrich. Within the walls stretched a city unlike anything Eliona had ever imagined. Crowded streets twisted between rows of timber houses and grand stone buildings. Blacksmiths hammered glowing steel beneath open workshops. Merchants shouted from colourful market stalls piled high with bread, wool, spices, and polished silver. Children chased one another through narrow alleys while bells echoed from distant temples. Everything felt alive. Everything moved. Yet beneath the noise, something else lingered. People spoke in lowered voices. Soldiers patrolled nearly every street. Iron cages stood outside the city gates. Inside them hung the weathered skulls of wolves. Eliona looked away. Her chest tightened. Hatred had become part of this kingdom's architecture. Commander Roderick noticed her expression. "You pity them." She remained silent. "They slaughter livestock. They attack caravans. They steal children from lonely farms." His voice held complete certainty. "They deserve worse." Eliona remembered the little wolf sleeping peacefully beside her fire. She remembered the Alpha King's quiet bow. Neither memory matched the commander's words. The royal castle overlooked the city from the highest hill. Its walls were built from pale granite that glowed softly beneath the winter light. Massive oak doors opened into a hall so vast that Eliona's footsteps echoed across polished stone. Marble pillars stretched toward a ceiling painted with scenes of ancient kings defeating beasts beneath crimson banners. Large fireplaces filled the air with warmth, yet the castle somehow felt colder than the frozen valley outside. Servants hurried silently through the corridors. Nobles whispered behind embroidered sleeves. Every face seemed guarded. Every smile seemed practiced. Commander Roderick led Eliona before the throne. King Aldrich sat upon carved white oak beneath a canopy of blue velvet. He was older than she had expected. Silver threaded through his dark hair. Lines of exhaustion rested around his eyes. His shoulders remained straight, but there was a heaviness in the way he held himself, as though years of difficult choices had settled like invisible armor upon his back. He studied Eliona for several moments. "You are the woman." His voice was calm. "The one the wolves refused to harm." Eliona bowed respectfully. "I only helped an injured animal." Murmurs spread across the gathered nobles. King Aldrich leaned forward. "The Alpha King himself visited your village." "Yes." "And gifted you an ancient pendant." "Yes." The king's gaze sharpened. "Why?" Eliona met his eyes. "I don't know." The honesty in her answer surprised even the court. Several nobles exchanged uncertain glances. Commander Roderick stepped forward. "Your Majesty, she hides the truth." The wolves obeyed her. They honored her. "They seek something." King Aldrich slowly stood. His boots echoed across the throne room. I have spent 20 years trying to understand Blackpine Forest. He walked toward one of the towering windows overlooking the snowy kingdom. My father believed unimaginable treasures were hidden beneath those mountains. He sent explorers. They vanished. He sent hunters. They never returned. He sent soldiers. Only empty horses came home. His reflection stared back from the frozen glass. Whatever the wolves protect. His voice became almost a whisper. It belongs to the crown. Eliana's heart sank. This was no longer about fear. It was about greed. She was taken not to a dungeon but to a quiet chamber high within the castle tower. The windows overlooked the eastern mountains. The room was simple. A bed. A table. A fireplace. The door, however, remained locked from the outside. A prisoner could still be treated politely. Days passed. Servants brought food. Guards remained outside. No one questioned her. No one explained why she was being kept there. Each evening she stood beside the narrow window watching distant forests disappear beneath the setting sun. Sometimes, far beyond the city, she imagined hearing wolves. Soft, faint, almost carried by memory itself. On the 7th night, someone knocked gently upon her door. Not the heavy pounding of soldiers. A careful knock. The lock turned. An elderly man entered carrying several old books beneath one arm. His white beard reached nearly to his waist. Small round spectacles rested upon the end of his nose. Ink stained his fingertips. He looked more like a gardener than a royal scholar. He smiled kindly. "So, you are Eliana?" She nodded. "And you are?" "Edmund, the castle librarian." He carefully placed the books upon the table. "I have spent 50 years reading histories most kings never bother opening." His eyes drifted toward the pendant resting around her neck. "I was hoping I might see that." Eliana instinctively covered it with her hand. "You know what it is." His smile disappeared. "I prayed I would never see it again." He slowly opened one of the ancient books. Its pages had yellowed with age. The ink had faded. At the center rested a beautiful illustration. A silver wolf stood beside a human queen. Neither appeared afraid. Their hands, or rather, her hand and the wolf's paw, rested together upon a glowing stone. Eliana stared at the page. It looks like the pendant." Professor Edmund nodded. "It is the same symbol. The Heartstone." He turned several pages. There was a time when humans and wolves were not enemies. Eliana looked at him in disbelief. "That's impossible." "So everyone believes." The old scholar walked slowly toward the fire. "For nearly 300 years, that has been the kingdom's greatest lie." The flames crackled softly. Outside, snow drifted across the castle windows. The wolves of Blackpine were never wild beasts. They were guardians. Protectors. They watched over the Valley of Springs. Eliana frowned. "What springs?" Edmund looked toward the dark mountains beyond the glass. "The springs that feed every river flowing through this kingdom. The water beneath every village. Every farm. Every orchard." He closed the book carefully. Without those hidden springs, Erindor would become dust. Silence settled between them. The fire popped quietly. "If that is true," Eliana whispered, "why does everyone believe the wolves are monsters?" The old scholar lowered his eyes. "Because greed rewrote history." He drew a slow breath. Long ago, one king desired the sacred valley for himself. He wanted its endless water. Its hidden riches. The wolves refused. So he did what frightened rulers often do. He turned protectors into villains. He burned the records. He executed anyone who spoke the truth. And generation after generation, the lie became history. Eliana felt her fingers tighten around the pendant. "The Alpha King." "He knows." Edmund nodded. "He remembers." The wolves pass memory differently than we do. Their kings teach each generation. They have never forgotten. The old scholar looked directly into her eyes. And neither has that pendant. A chill passed through the room. Not from the winter air. From the weight of what she had just learned. Edmund spoke one final sentence before leaving. The Alpha King did not choose you because you are powerful. He chose you because compassion cannot be inherited. It can only be proven. The old man quietly gathered his books. As he reached the door, he paused. There are darker things happening inside this castle than you realize. What do you mean? He looked back over his shoulder. Commander Roderick has convinced the king that the time has finally come to invade Blackpine Forest. Eleonora's heart skipped. The army leaves in 3 days. The door closed softly behind him. She stood frozen beside the fire. Beyond the castle walls, snow continued to fall over the sleeping kingdom. Far away, deep within Blackpine Forest, a lone wolf lifted its head toward the stars. Its howl echoed across the mountains, not as a cry of anger, but as a warning. And for the first time since leaving Briar Hollow, Eleonora understood exactly what was at stake. The howl lingered over the kingdom long after the sound itself had faded. Eleonora stood motionless beside the narrow window of her chamber, her hand resting against the cold stone wall. Snow drifted across the castle courtyard below, covering the footprints of soldiers changing watch. The city slept peacefully, unaware that an army was preparing to march toward a war built upon centuries of lies. She could not stay. Every hour she remained inside the castle brought Blackpine Forest closer to destruction. The words of Professor Edmund echoed through her mind. Compassion cannot be inherited. It can only be proven. She looked at the pendant once more. The emerald stone glowed faintly beneath the firelight, almost as if it were waiting. The following evening, the castle celebrated the beginning of the winter feast. Music filled the great halls. Nobles laughed over tables heavy with roasted pheasant, fresh bread, honey cakes, and steaming wine. Silver goblets clinked together beneath sparkling chandeliers. Outside, snow continued falling without sound. Inside the tower, the guards outside Eleonora's chamber grew distracted by the celebration below. One left to fetch food. The other lingered near the stairwell, listening to distant music echo through the corridors. A quiet knock came at her door. Before she could answer, the lock clicked open. Professor Edmund slipped inside. His heavy wool cloak was dusted with snow. In one hand he carried an old lantern whose flame had been turned almost completely down. "You must come," he whispered. "There isn't much time." Eleonora hesitated only a heartbeat before following him into the dim corridor. The old scholar moved with surprising confidence through the maze of passageways. Instead of descending the grand staircases, he led her into forgotten servant tunnels hidden behind ancient tapestries. Dust covered the stone floors. Cobwebs stretched across unused doorways. The air smelled of damp earth and old timber. At the end of one narrow passage stood an iron door half concealed behind broken barrels. Edmund pushed it open. Cold night air rushed inside. Beyond the doorway waited the castle gardens, buried beneath untouched snow. No guards. No servants. Only silence. "You know the Eastern Trail?" Edmund asked. She nodded. "It leads toward Blackpine. Ride until the mountains disappear behind you." He reached into the shadows and gently patted the neck of a chestnut mare waiting beside the garden wall. "I've prepared everything." The horse snorted softly, white breath curling into the icy air. Eleonora looked back toward the towering castle. "If I leave, I may never return." The old man smiled sadly. History rarely changes because someone remained where it was safe. His weathered hand rested briefly upon hers. "Go." She climbed into the saddle. For a moment neither spoke. Then she leaned down. "Thank you." Professor Edmund shook his head. "When this story is told years from now." His eyes glistened in the lantern light. "I hope they remember the woman who chose kindness before courage." Eleonora gently guided the mare through the sleeping gardens. Within moments she disappeared beyond the eastern gate. The old scholar remained standing alone until both horse and rider vanished into the falling snow. The moon climbed high above the mountains as Eliana rode east. The frozen road wound between cliffs glazed with ice. Towering pines lined the trail, their branches bending beneath fresh snow until they formed silent white arches overhead. The deeper she traveled into the wilderness, the quieter the world became. No wagon wheels. No voices. Only the steady rhythm of hoofbeats. Hours passed. Clouds slowly parted. Moonlight spilled across the landscape, turning the snow into a sea of silver. Then, the mare stopped. Its ears stood upright. Its breathing became slow and uncertain. Eliana followed the horse's gaze. Between the trees, golden eyes appeared. One pair, then another, then dozens. They stepped silently from the darkness. Large wolves. Small wolves. Grey. Black. White. None growled. None threatened. They simply surrounded the narrow trail without blocking it. Waiting. Watching. A familiar figure limped through the gathering. The little wolf pup. Its injured leg had healed remarkably. Only a faint stiffness remained in its walk. The moment it saw Eliana, its tail wagged with joyful excitement. It bounded toward her, stopping beside the mare before lifting its nose happily into her hand. "You've grown stronger." She smiled warmly. The pup answered with a cheerful whine. The surrounding wolves quietly stepped aside. A path opened through the forest. An invitation. Eliana looked ahead. "I suppose," she whispered. "I'm meant to follow." The little wolf trotted forward. She guided the mare behind it. The pack flowed silently around them like living shadows beneath the moon. Blackpine Forest seemed different from the inside. The trees rose taller than any she had imagined. Ancient trunks twisted toward the heavens, their bark covered with emerald moss that somehow remained alive despite the deep winter. Soft blue lights drifted lazily through the darkness. Not stars. Tiny glowing insects floated between the branches like wandering lanterns. Crystal-clear streams flowed beneath thin layers of ice, their gentle music blending with the whisper of the wind. Everywhere she looked, life endured. Foxes watched curiously from rocky hillsides. Owls glided silently overhead. Snow hares darted between roots before disappearing into hidden burrows. Nothing appeared frightened. Nothing fled. The forest breathed with peaceful confidence. Hours later, the trees suddenly opened. Eliana's breath caught. Before her stretched a valley unlike anything she had ever imagined. Towering cliffs surrounded a vast meadow untouched by winter. Green grass swayed gently despite the snow covering the mountains beyond. Ancient oaks spread their enormous branches across fields filled with wildflowers that glowed softly beneath the moon. Dozens of waterfalls poured from hidden caves high within the cliffs, feeding pools so clear they reflected every star above. Mist rose gently from the water. Warm. Alive. The air smelled of fresh earth, pine resin, and blooming flowers. Winter had never entered this place. "This," Eliana whispered, "is impossible." A deep voice answered, not with words, but with presence. The Alpha King emerged from beneath the ancient trees. Moonlight shimmered across his magnificent silver coat. He walked with the same calm strength she remembered from Briar Hollow, yet here, within his own kingdom, he seemed even larger. Even more regal. Every wolf bowed as he passed. The little pup hurried toward him, rubbing gently against his powerful foreleg before looking proudly back at Eliana. The Alpha King stopped only a few steps away. His golden eyes searched her face. No fear remained between them. Only quiet understanding. Slowly, he lowered his great head. Eliana hesitated before extending one trembling hand. Her fingertips touched the thick silver fur between his ears. Warm. Softer than she expected. The great wolf closed his eyes for the briefest moment. A deep, peaceful breath escaped him. Around the valley, every wolf remained perfectly still. The ancient king had accepted her. The pendant hanging around Eliana's neck suddenly grew warm. Very warm. She looked down. The emerald stone glowed brighter than ever before. Thin lines of green light spread across its carved surface. Without thinking, she followed its gentle pull. The wolves quietly parted. The Alpha King walked beside her. They climbed a winding path leading toward the center of the valley. At its highest point stood an enormous spring. Water bubbled upward from deep within the earth, glowing faintly with silver light before flowing into countless streams that disappeared beneath the surrounding cliffs. Professor Edmund had spoken the truth. This single spring fed the kingdom. Life itself began here. As Eliana approached the water's edge, the pendant shone brilliantly. Its reflection danced across the surface. The spring answered. Soft ripples spread outward without a single breeze touching the water. Then, images appeared. Not reflections. Memories. She saw men and wolves standing together. Children laughing beside the same spring. A human queen placing the Heartstone into the paws of an ancient silver wolf. Promises spoken. Hands joined. Peace celebrated. The vision shifted. Flames. Steel. Screams. Soldiers marching beneath royal banners. Trees burning. Bodies falling. A king reaching greedily toward the spring while wolves fought desperately to protect it. Then darkness. The water became still once more. Tears slipped silently down Eliana's cheeks. It was all true. The Alpha King stood beside her. His eyes reflected centuries of grief. Not hatred. Grief. He had carried these memories all his life. His father before him. And his father's father before that. Generations waiting for someone willing to see the truth. The little wolf heir gently rested against Eliana's leg. She knelt beside him, wrapping both arms around the young wolf. I promise. She whispered through trembling tears. I won't let them destroy this place. The Alpha King lifted his head toward the stars. His deep howl rolled across the valley. This time, it carried hope. But far beyond the sacred valley, another sound disturbed the night. The distant echo of iron striking stone. Axes biting into frozen trees. The march of hundreds of armored soldiers. Lord Varric's army had entered Blackpine Forest. And they were bringing fire with them. The Alpha King's howl had barely faded when another sound rolled through Blackpine Forest. Not the song of wolves. Not the whisper of rivers. Iron. Hundreds of axes struck ancient pines in slow, relentless rhythm. Metal chains scraped across frozen stone. The distant thud of marching boots traveled through the ground until even the clear waters of the sacred spring trembled with tiny ripples. Every wolf in the valley lifted its head. The peaceful silence vanished. Birds burst from the treetops in frightened clouds. Deer fled through the meadows, their white tails flashing between the oaks. Even the glowing insects disappeared into the shadows. The forest itself seemed to recoil. The Alpha King stood perfectly still upon the rocky ledge overlooking the valley. His amber eyes narrowed toward the eastern ridge. One deep breath filled his broad chest. Then he looked at Eliana. No growl. No command. Only quiet understanding. She already knew. The war that had been prevented for centuries had finally reached the gates of the sacred valley. The wolves moved first. Not in panic. Not in anger. With calm precision. Older wolves guided the smallest pups toward hidden caves carved deep beneath the cliffs. Mothers gathered their young with gentle nudges. Strong hunters climbed rocky ledges overlooking the narrow mountain passes. Others disappeared into the trees without making the slightest sound. Every wolf knew its place. No one barked orders. No one hesitated. It was as though the forest itself breathed through them. Eliana watched in silent awe. They've prepared for this. She whispered. The Alpha King slowly inclined his head. Generations had expected this day. Hope had simply delayed it. Smoke appeared above the eastern trees. Thin at first. Then thicker. Black clouds climbed into the pale morning sky. The smell reached them moments later. Burning pine. Pitch. Fresh sap. The scent spread through the valley like poison. Eliana's stomach tightened. They're setting the forest on fire. The little wolf heir stood beside her. Its ears flattened. A quiet whine escaped its throat. She gently rested her hand upon its head. We won't let them reach the spring. The young wolf looked up at her with complete trust. A trust she prayed she deserved. Several hours later, the first soldiers appeared beyond the ridge. Blue banners bearing the royal stag rose above rows of armored men. Archers marched behind heavy shields. Engineers dragged iron cages and strange wooden machines through the snow. Behind them came wagons loaded with oil barrels. Lord Varric rode at the front upon a towering black horse. His polished armor gleamed beneath the weak winter sun. He studied the untouched valley with hungry eyes. "So," he murmured. The legends were true. Behind him, several officers stared in open disbelief. The green valley, the waterfalls, the glowing spring. One whispered, "My lord, it's beautiful." Varric's expression hardened. "It will belong to the crown." His gaze settled upon the spring. "No," he corrected himself with a cold smile. "It will belong to me." Eliona stepped from the trees before anyone else could move. Snow crunched beneath her boots. The emerald pendant rested openly against her chest. The Alpha King remained behind her. So did hundreds of wolves. Neither side advanced. The valley held its breath. Varric laughed. "So the witch arrives." Eliona stopped halfway between the army and the wolves. "You've been lied to." Her voice carried clearly through the frozen air. "The wolves protect this valley. They always have." Varric smiled without warmth. "And now they have taught you their lies." He slowly drew his sword. "This spring belongs to mankind." "It belongs to no one," Eliona answered. "It gives life freely. You cannot own what keeps every living thing alive." Several soldiers exchanged uncertain glances. They had expected monsters. Instead, they saw wolves standing quietly beside flowing water. They saw mothers sheltering pups. They saw no army preparing to attack. Only guardians refusing to abandon their home. Varric noticed their hesitation. His eyes darkened. He could not allow doubt to grow. "Archers!" Rows of bows lifted together. The sound of tightening bowstrings echoed across the valley. Eliona's heart pounded. She looked toward the Alpha King. He remained perfectly still. Waiting. Trusting her. She slowly walked forward until she stood directly between the soldiers and the wolves. Gasps spread through both armies. Varric frowned. "Move." She shook her head. "If you wish to kill them." Her voice trembled but did not break. "You'll have to shoot through me." Silence. Only the waterfalls continued singing. The commander of the archers lowered his bow slightly. "My lord." Varric turned sharply. "Did I give permission to hesitate?" "No, my lord." "Then fire." The command struck the valley like thunder. But no arrows flew. The soldiers looked at one another. None wished to become the man who killed an innocent woman standing without a weapon. Varric's face twisted with rage. "Cowards!" He snatched a bow from the nearest archer. "I'll do it myself." He drew the string back. The arrow pointed directly at Eliona's heart. The little wolf heir suddenly ran toward her. "No!" Eliona cried. The pup reached her side just as Varric released the arrow. Time seemed to slow. The arrow cut through the cold air with a sharp whistle. The Alpha King moved. He exploded forward with astonishing speed. His silver body blurred across the snow. He struck Eliona with his shoulder. She fell sideways. The arrow missed her, but buried itself deep into the Alpha King's chest. A terrible silence followed. The great wolf staggered. Blood stained his silver fur. The little heir let out a broken cry unlike anything Eliona had ever heard. "No!" She crawled across the snow, reaching the wounded king just as he sank onto one knee. His breathing had become heavy. Pain flickered in his golden eyes. Yet instead of turning toward Varric, he looked only at the frightened young heir, then gently touched his nose against the pup's forehead. A father's reassurance. Even now, even wounded, his first concern was his son. Something changed inside the soldiers. One by one, bows lowered, swords dipped. No monster would have sacrificed himself to save a human. But a king would. A true king always would. Lord Varric saw the doubt spreading. He realized he was losing them. His voice rose into a furious roar. "They're beasts. They've deceived you all. Without warning, he drew a torch from his saddle and hurled it toward the nearest oil barrel. Flames exploded upward. Fire raced across the dry pine needles. The eastern edge of the valley erupted into blazing orange light. Smoke swallowed the sky. Animals fled in every direction. Chaos had begun. The battle that everyone feared could no longer be stopped.